The Varrock had mapped this corner of the galaxy before humans had learned to smelt iron. They knew the Keth Nebula, the way old men know the cracks in their own ceilings. Every dust pocket, every dead star, every corridor of radiation that made lesser ships shake apart at the seams. Survey Fleet 7 had run this route 11 times in 40 years, and Commander Seville Dorn had personally run it 3. There was nothing here. There had never been anything here. The mission was formality dressed as purpose. Then the human ship appeared on the edge of the long-range scan. It was small. Embarrassingly small, the kind of vessel the Varrock used for moving administrative cargo between minor outposts. It had no weapons signature worth logging. Its hull composition was a generation behind current technology, maybe 2. It sat near the outer membrane of the Keth Nebula, and it was doing something with its sensors, slow and methodical, the way a person runs their hand along a wall in the dark. Seville Dorn looked at the scan. He looked at his navigation officer. The navigation officer looked at the scan. "Muras," the officer said. "The soft ones." It was not said with contempt. It was said the way you say the name of a bird that has wandered into a room, acknowledged, unremarkable, to be noted, and then forgotten. Seville Dorn opened a channel. The woman who appeared on the screen was perhaps 40 years old by human measure, with close-cropped hair and the kind of calm that came not from discipline, but from a genuine absence of alarm. She was eating something. She put it down when the channel opened, not with guilt, but with the unhurried ease of someone who sees no reason to perform composure, because she already has it. "Commander?" she said. Her translation node was good, better than Seville Dorn expected. "I'm Captain Mara Osei. We're out of the Kepler Deep Survey Division. Didn't expect company out here." "This corridor falls within Varrock survey jurisdiction," Seville Dorn said. The words were not a threat. They were information, delivered in the flat tone of a man reading a document aloud. "Of course," she said, not apologetically, not defensively, as if he had told her something she already knew and was simply confirming receipt. "We won't be long. Another few days of measurements, and we'll be out of your way." She paused. "Can I ask, would your crew want anything? We have extra provisions. Some of it's probably terrible by your standards, but the offer stands." Seville Dorn stared at her. She was offering them food. In a chance encounter in empty space, he ran a brief internal check. Was this a diplomatic gesture? A show of submission? A behavioral signal of some recognized category? It was none of those things. She simply appeared to mean it. "That will not be necessary," he said. "Fair enough." She smiled. "Safe travels, Commander." The channel closed. Seville Dorn sat back in his seat and said nothing for a moment. Then he dictated a brief administrative notation: "Human survey vessel encountered. No incident, no action required," and moved on. At the rear of the command deck, junior analyst Yen Thal had been watching. She was young for her posting, selected not for seniority but for an unusual capacity that her evaluators had described, with mild unease, as an inability to let things go. She had been flagged twice for pursuing inquiries beyond their formal closure. Both times, she had found something. Both times her superiors had accepted the findings while quietly recommending she develop a better sense of when to stop. She had not developed one. She pulled the human vessel's trajectory data from the scan archive. It was public information. Passive sensor sweeps didn't require permission, and she read through it the way you read through something when you don't know what you're looking for, but suspect it's there. The ship had been here before. Not this ship, exactly. But human vessels had been making measurements at these exact coordinates, these specific ones, not approximate, not nearby, but precise to the meter for 31 years. The datasets matched. Each visit had expanded the previous one. Each set of measurements was a layer placed over the last, with the care of someone building something that needed to be right. She sat with that. They were not exploring. Explorers cast wide. They moved outward, hungry for the new edge. This was different. This was the behavior of someone returning to a site, because the site mattered. Someone who needed to know this particular piece of space very, very well. She pulled the surrounding stellar geography. The Keth Nebula sat at the junction of 3 long-haul transit corridors, routes used almost exclusively by Varick logistics fleets, moving supplies between the outer colonies and the deep interior. Civilian traffic, mostly. Administrative cargo. The infrastructure that kept the Empire fed and supplied and connected. She stared at the map for a long time. Then she flagged the file and sent it to Sval Dorn with a note that read, "The human vessel was not conducting general survey work. The measurement pattern suggests repeat site analysis over 3 decades. Recommend cross-referencing with Varick logistics corridor maps before closing the encounter report." Sval Dorn read it that evening. He sent back 2 words, noted, closed. Yenthal stared at his response. She thought about the captain, the unhurried calm, the offered food, the complete absence of the kind of anxiety that small ships showed when large ships appeared on their screens. No threat display. No deference performance. Just a woman eating something and extending an offer she expected to be declined. She thought about what it meant to return to the same coordinates for 31 years. She pulled the full trajectory archive. Not just this encounter, every logged instance of human vessels in this region. It took the archive 3 minutes to compile. That was a long time. A long time meant a large file. She had not expected a large file. The file was very large. She began mapping the visits against the logistics corridor data. 1 corridor, then a second, then a third, then a fourth. She hadn't initially included because it ran further out and seemed irrelevant. It was not irrelevant. The human measurement sites formed a pattern across all 4 corridors. She stared at the shape of it on her display. She rotated it. She checked her own work twice, because the checking was automatic, necessary, the thing you did before you let yourself believe what you were seeing. The pattern was complete. Methodical. Old. She saved the file under a personal designation, not because she was hiding it, but because she didn't know yet what category to file it under. Official categories required a named threat type, a known behavior class, an established framework for what a thing was. She didn't have one for this yet. She would spend 3 years finding one. The border incident was minor. A human freighter cargo class, commercial registration, carrying processed grain and agricultural machinery, had drifted 11 light minutes into the edge of the Varick 7th Logistics Corridor. Its navigation system had logged a beacon error. The crew had corrected course within hours. No cargo was lost. No Varick vessel was inconvenienced. The freighter's captain had filed a formal apology through the nearest relay station, the kind of apology that was thorough and slightly excessive, the kind that people file when they are genuinely embarrassed and want the record to show it. That should have been the end of it. It would have been the end of it, if Yenthal had not spent 3 years quietly building a file that no one had asked for. She submitted it through official channels on a Tuesday, attached to the border incident report as supplementary analysis. Her cover notation was 4 sentences long. The high assessors of the Intelligence Directorate received it, filed it in the review queue, and did not look at it for 6 weeks. When they did look at it, they called her in. The chamber was large and cold in the way that important rooms in old institutions are always large and cold. The temperature of authority, she had always thought. 3 assessors sat at the curved table. Senior Assessor Davan Kell, who had served in the directorate for longer than Yenthal had been alive, looked at her with the expression of someone who has learned to be careful about being impressed. "You compiled this yourself," he said. "Yes." "Over how long?" 3 years, 4 months. Intermittently. Davan Kell looked at the other 2 assessors. They looked back. Some communication happened in that silence. The shorthand of people who have worked together for decades. "Walk us through it," he said. She did. 30 years of human survey vessels, all returning to the same sites. Not random sites, specific sites, selected with a precision that ruled out coincidence after the first decade. The sites mapped against the Varick logistics corridor infrastructure. The pattern that emerged when you laid one over the other. The gravitational stress points places where the corridor geometry created natural choke points, where a disruption of the right size and type would cascade backward through the supply chain for months. Every one of those stress points had been visited by human vessels, more than once, some of them more than a dozen times. "They didn't know these were our corridors," the second assessor said. It was not quite a question. Not in the early period, no. Yenthal said. The first measurements predate first contact by 11 years. They were mapping this space before they knew we existed. Then why? Because they map everything, she said. That is the behavior pattern. It is not strategic in origin. It is compulsive. They return to sites repeatedly, build up layers of data across decades, and then file it. The filing is what I followed. She pulled up a secondary display, not just the Varick corridors, but the broader human survey record, asteroid fields, radiation zones, debris clouds from ancient collisions, dead stars, all of it measured, documented, returned to. They do this everywhere, she said. Every region they have access to. The Varick corridors are not special to them. They are simply part of everything, and everything gets measured. Davankel leaned back. And the contingency files? Yes. She brought those up. A deep archive analyst in her division had located them 6 months ago, human governmental documents, not classified, simply never considered interesting enough to translate fully. She had translated them fully. The files were organized under a category the humans called Scenario Planning Asymmetric Engagement. Each one addressed a specific potential conflict with a specific named civilization. Most of them were short, preliminary, the kind of document you filed to show institutional thoroughness and then updated once every 5 years out of obligation. The Varick file was not short. It was 319 pages. It had been written 11 years ago by a division of the human government called the Strategic Continuity Office, a name that took Yenthal a moment to parse, because the word continuity was doing unusual work. Not victory, not dominance, continuity. It had been revised 9 times. The third assessor, who had been quiet until now, spoke. What does it cover? Every Varick attack vector they could model, Yenthal said. Our fleet formations, our standard engagement doctrine, our logistics dependencies, the same stress points from the survey data, our colony resupply schedules, our communication relay architecture, our historical response time between threat identification and fleet deployment. She paused. And defensive responses for each. Evacuation timelines. Infrastructure stripping protocols. Methods to make occupied systems costly to hold. Silence. It is not an offensive document, she said. There is no section on how to attack us. It is entirely about how to survive being attacked by us. Davankel looked at her. They wrote this 11 years ago. Yes. Before any significant diplomatic incident between our civilizations. Yes. Why? She had thought about this for a long time. She had run the question through multiple analytical frameworks and come back to the same place each time. Because they do not assume they will not be attacked, she said. Not by us specifically, by anyone. The same office has similar files for 7 other civilizations. The Varick file is the longest, which I believe reflects their assessment of our capability, not our intent. She let that settle. They plan from the premise that the worst will happen, not because they believe it will, but because leaving it unplanned makes them uncomfortable. Davankel was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Yenthal had not expected from a senior assessor of the Intelligence Directorate. He said it quietly, almost to himself, as if he was not entirely sure it was an appropriate thing to say in a formal chamber. That is a strange way to live. Yes, Yenthal said. She thought about Mara Osei again. The offered food. The absolute absence of alarm. I think, she said carefully, that it is also why she was not afraid of us. The assessors looked at her. She did not elaborate. She did not have clean language for it yet. The idea that perhaps the two things were connected. That you could afford to be calm in a moment, because you had already sat with every version of how the moment could destroy you. That the preparation was what made the smile possible. She filed it away. Davankel closed the session and told her the directorate would review the full submission. He thanked her for her thoroughness in the tone of a man who was thanking her for something he was not entirely glad to have received. She walked back to her office. She sat down. She pulled up the contingency file again, not to analyze it, just to sit with the shape of it. 319 pages. 9 revisions. A document built not in anger or ambition but in the quiet, compulsive logic of a species that had decided, somewhere long ago, that the most dangerous thing in the universe was to be surprised. She sat with that for a long time. The claim was filed on a Wednesday. Administrative Division, Colonial Expansion Office, Varric Empire, Resource Extraction Rights System, Koru, Class 3, Planetary Body, Primary and Secondary Mineral Deposits. It was 4 pages long. Standard template. The kind of document that got filed and processed and approved in the same week, because the Colonial Expansion Office processed hundreds of them per cycle, and the people who worked there had long since stopped reading them as anything other than coordinates and deposit classifications. Nobody at the Colonial Expansion Office knew that humans had been terraforming the second planet in the Koru system for 61 years. Nobody had thought to check. The notification reached the Human Administrative Office at Koru Station on a Friday, routed through standard diplomatic channels as a courtesy, not a request for acknowledgement, just an informational copy, the kind of document you sent, because the protocols said to send it. A secondary note explained that extraction operations would begin within 30 days. The human administrator who received it was a woman named Petra Solis. She read it once. She read it again. She sent a brief query to the Colonial Expansion Office, asking whether they were aware of the current human habitation status of Koru. 2. Including the 61 years of atmospheric processing, soil conditioning, and the 3 settlements, with a combined population of 40,000 people. The Colonial Expansion Office sent back a form letter acknowledging receipt of her query. She forwarded the entire exchange to Ambassador Daro Essian. Essian was a quiet man. He had been the human diplomatic envoy to Varric Space for 9 years, which was a long time to spend in a posting that mostly required patience and an ability to communicate clearly, in a language whose grammar assumed the speaker always knew more than the listener. He was not a dramatic person. His staff described him as methodical. His counterparts in the Varric Diplomatic Corps described him, in their internal communications, as difficult to read, which was as close as the Varric ever got to admitting someone made them uncertain. He read Petra Solis's forwarded exchange. He read it again. Then he requested an emergency meeting with the Varric Colonial Expansion Office, through official channels, with formal priority flags. He did not raise his voice in the request. He did not use language that signaled alarm. The priority flags were simply there, precise, and correctly applied, in the way that a person who knows the rules uses them without performance. The Colonial Expansion Office agreed to a meeting in 3 weeks. Essian sent a second communication, accepting the date. He also attached, without comment, a single document, a survey record, showing 61 years of continuous human presence at Koru. 2. With the atmospheric processing timelines, the population records, and the terraforming investment figures. The Colonial Expansion Office acknowledged receipt. No further response. The 30-day extraction window opened. Varric extraction ships entered the Koru system. They began initial surveys of the primary mineral deposit sites. That was when the quiet started. Not quiet on Koru, 2. On Koru, 2. Petra Solis was coordinating a legal challenge through every available diplomatic and administrative channel simultaneously, doing it thoroughly and without visible panic, the way people manage crises when they have practiced for crises. The 40,000 residents had not been evacuated. There was no order to evacuate, and no one with authority had suggested it. The quiet was elsewhere. 3 weeks after extraction operations began, the resupply route serving Varric Fleet Station Torin, 4 transit jumps, from the Koru system, logged its first navigation anomaly. A beacon timestamp was wrong by 9 minutes. Not enough to cause a problem, enough to require a manual correction. The route logistics officer flagged it as equipment drift and filed a maintenance request. A week later, 2 more beacons on the same route showed similar errors. Different beacons, not adjacent. Spaced in a way that did not suggest equipment drift. A different route, further out, developed a debris field problem. Not a new debris field, the debris had always been there. The remnants of an old collision catalogued decades ago. But the density mapping used for safe navigation was wrong. The debris had shifted, or the old mapping had been imprecise, or something. Ships could still navigate it. They simply had to slow down. They simply had to take longer. Then a third route. A sensor ghost, a false return that caused automated systems to flag a mass that wasn't there. Standard procedure required a scan verification before proceeding. Scan verifications took time. None of it was dangerous. None of it was attributable. Space was large and complicated, and things went wrong in it every day, for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone. Fleet Admiral Seville Dorn, who had been transferred to the Kourou Regional Command 6 months earlier, received Yenthal's urgent message on a Thursday morning. She had cross-referenced the anomaly reports against the contingency file. Every anomaly corresponded to a Varick logistics vulnerability she had identified in her original briefing 3 years ago. Not approximately. Precisely. The beacons that were wrong were the beacons at the gravitational stress points. The debris field that needed re-navigation was in the corridor choke point she had flagged. The sensor ghost was sitting at the junction she had marked as the single highest impact disruption point in the outer supply network. Seville Dorn read the message. He sat with it. He pulled the contingency file, the full translated version, which had been circulated to regional fleet commands after Yenthal's directorate briefing. He found page 47. The section was titled Passive Infrastructure Degradation Phase 1. It described, in technical but readable language, a method of introducing compounding inefficiencies into an opponent's logistics network without any single action rising to the level of an attributable act. It read like a manual. He was looking at page 47 of the manual. He sent a communication to the high assessors. He recommended a formal review of the Kourou extraction order. He used careful language. He did not use words like mistake because he was a fleet admiral, and fleet admirals did not tell the high assessors they had made mistakes. They described situations that warranted reassessment. The high assessors reviewed his communication and responded within the day. Their conclusion? The Muras were being petulant. The anomalies were coincidence. The extraction order stood. Increase operational tempo to demonstrate commitment. Any signal of hesitation would be read as weakness. Seville Dorn filed the response and stared at the wall of his office for a long time. Then Ambassador Daro Essian formally requested a meeting with the Varick Diplomatic Council. The request was in perfect procedural order. The attached documentation was thorough. The tone was, as always, measured and clear. He arrived at the meeting chamber alone. He sat down. He placed a single data chip on the table, in front of the lead council representative. He said nothing. The council representative picked up the chip and loaded it. One file. The title on the cover document had been changed from its original version, where it had previously read, Scenario Class, Extremely Unlikely. The classification had been updated. It now read, Scenario Class, Active. The file was 412 pages. The chamber was quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than the Varick were used to. Not the quiet of resolution or the quiet of waiting. Something without a category. Something that sat in the chest like a stone that had been there for a while before anyone noticed it. The council representative looked at Essian. Essian looked back. Patient. Unhurried. The way a man looks when he has already done the thing that needed doing and is simply waiting for the other person to finish catching up. The room did not know what it was feeling. That was new. The fleet was 312 ships. It was not the largest force the Varick had ever assembled. That record belonged to the campaign against the Setheri, 70 years ago, which had ended in 11 months, and established the eastern boundary of the empire with a finality that no one had tested since. But 312 ships was serious. It was the kind of number that communicated intent beyond any diplomatic language. It was a door closing. Fleet Admiral Seville Dorn did not command the strike fleet. He had requested the assignment and been denied the high assessors. In their wisdom, preferred a commander less likely to recommend strategic reassessment mid-operation. The fleet went instead to Admiral Kale Var, a decorated officer with an excellent record and a clean, simple relationship with the concept of victory. Seville Dorn watched the departure from the regional command station. He stood at the observation window and watched 312 ships form up and translate out of local space in successive waves, precise and powerful, the way the Varick had always done things. He went back to his office. He opened the contingency file to page 1 and started reading from the beginning. He had read it before. He read it again. He read it the way you read something when you are hoping to find that you misunderstood it the first time. He had not misunderstood it. The first target was the Havre system. Significant human population. Industrial infrastructure. Shipyards, not large ones, but operational. It was the kind of system whose fall would send a signal through human space that the Varric intended to be heard. Admiral Cale Var translated the fleet into the Havre system at full combat readiness. The system was empty, not attacked, not destroyed. Empty. The population was gone. The shipyard infrastructure had been stripped, not blown up. Stripped, taken apart with organized efficiency, and removed piece by piece. What remained were the structural bones of the stations, bare and clean. The orbital platforms still functioned. The navigation beacons still transmitted. The lights were still on. And in the orbital debris field above the third planet, where the gap between two old asteroid clusters created the natural approach corridor that every fleet would use when entering from the standard translation point, carefully arranged debris. Not random. Arranged. Positioned in the precise configuration that maximized the disruption to standard Varric formation flying. Not enough to destroy ships. Enough to break formation. Enough to require time and fuel and attention to navigate safely. Cale Var ordered the fleet through. It took 6 hours instead of 1. He sent a report back to the High Assessors. The language was professional. The subtext, which the High Assessors had enough experience to read clearly, was that something was wrong in a way he did not yet have words for. They told him to proceed to the next target. The next system was the same, and the one after that. 7 systems, and each one the same story, evacuated, stripped, and seeded with delays. Debris fields. False sensor returns. Navigation hazards that were not quite dangerous enough to justify going around but just costly enough that going through them accumulated. Fuel. Time. Morale. All of it bleeding out in careful increments. Cale Var's fleet was 3 weeks into the campaign when the supply problem started. The first resupply convoy was late. Beacon error, the logistics report said. Corrected course. Delayed 12 hours. 12 hours was not a crisis. 12 hours was logged and moved on from. Then the second convoy. Then a fuel depot in the rear corridor that had gone offline for maintenance. Scheduled maintenance. Filed properly. But the timing was unfortunate. Then a navigation relay that was functioning but transmitting on a slightly wrong frequency, requiring every ship that passed through to make a manual correction. A small thing. A very small thing. The kind of thing that happens sometimes. Cale Var was not a stupid man. He recognized accumulation. He recognized the shape of what page 47 described. He sent a full situation report to the High Assessors and requested authorization to suspend the advance and address the logistics chain. The High Assessors denied the request. Forward momentum was essential. Halt would signal weakness. Proceed. He proceeded. Yenthal had been recalled to the Central Directorate 2 weeks into the campaign. She had not been told why, exactly only that she was needed. She traveled on a fast courier and arrived to find the Intelligence Directorate in a state that she had never seen before and did not have a word for. Not panic, not chaos, something quieter. The quality of a room full of very intelligent people who have encountered a problem that is not solving the way problems are supposed to solve. She was brought before the High Assessors. There were 7 of them. They were old, all of them old in the way that the Varric who reached those positions were old, meaning they had seen everything, adjudicated everything, and built the settled certainty of people who had been right about important things enough times to trust their own judgment without constant verification. They looked at her the way they had not looked at her 3 years ago. "Tell us where we are," Senior Assessor Davon Kell said. She told them. The fleet was advancing through empty space. Every system abandoned before contact. Every position the humans had vacated was being used as a logistics cost against the Varric. The time to navigate the debris. The fuel burned. The supply chain stretched thin across the distance from the home infrastructure. The human industrial base had not been touched because the humans had moved it. The shipyards had been disassembled and relocated. The population was dispersed across systems the Varric had not identified as strategic. And the supply lines? She said. She showed them the cascade. 12 hours here, a day there, a frequency error, a beacon drift, a maintenance window, each one small. All of them together, accumulated over 3 weeks, meant the fleet was now operating at 71% supply efficiency and falling. In 4 more weeks, at current rates, they would need to pull back to resupply. When they pulled back, the human supply lines, which were functioning at full capacity, unmolested, because the Varric fleet had advanced into empty space and left the human rear alone, would have 4 weeks to continue the quiet work on the Varric corridors. And then the Varric would advance again, and the cycle would repeat. How long can they sustain this? Devon Kell said. Longer than we can sustain the advance, Yenthal said. They have not lost a ship. They have not lost a population center. They have not lost an industrial asset. Everything they evacuated is recoverable. Everything we have spent is spent. Silence. She looked at the assessors. 7 old faces. The most experienced minds in the Empire. All of them sitting with the same thing she had been sitting with for 3 years, arriving at it now in real time, feeling the shape of it for the first time. They planned this before the war started, one of them said. Not a question. They planned it before the incident at Koru, Yenthal said. Before the extraction order. Before any specific provocation. The evacuation protocols, the infrastructure stripping timelines, the logistics disruption campaign, all of it is in the file. The file that was written 11 years ago. They planned for a war that hadn't happened. They planned for a war that might happen. Those are not the same thing to them. She paused. She chose her next words carefully. They do not fight wars to win them. They design wars to survive them long enough that winning becomes too expensive for the other side. The room was very quiet. They have never assumed they would defeat us, she said. They began with the assumption that we were stronger, faster, and better armed. They built their entire strategy from that starting point. Not how do we win, how do we make them stop? Devon Kell looked at her for a long time. Then he asked her the question. The only question that mattered now. Is there a version of this war we win cleanly? She did not answer immediately. She looked at the table. She looked at the map on the display behind them, the fleet positions, the empty systems, the stretched supply lines, the intact human rear. She ran through it again, the way she had been running through it for weeks, looking for the clean path, the angle that resolved it. There was no clean path. She looked at Devon Kell. There is a version you survive, she said. The ceasefire came quietly. No ceremony. No public declaration. A formal communication through the established diplomatic channel. An agreed pause in military operations. And a date set for negotiations. The Varric fleet stopped advancing. The humans stopped nothing. Because the humans had not been advancing, they had been waiting. And waiting required no order to cease. Yenthal was appointed lead analyst to the Varric negotiation team. It was not the role she had expected. It was also not a surprise. She had become, through the long process of being right about things no one had wanted to hear, the person in the directorate whose read on the humans was considered the most reliable. That was a quiet kind of authority. She had learned to carry it without comment. She traveled to the neutral station where the talks would be held. It was an old waypoint facility merchant traffic, mostly, the kind of place where different species coexisted through mutual indifference and a shared interest in the availability of fuel. It had no political weight. That was the point. She arrived a day early. Ambassador Daro Essian was already there. She saw him in the station's common corridor, speaking with one of his staff, a young man who was clearly exhausted and clearly trying not to show it. Essian was listening to the young man with the full quality of his attention, the kind of listening that did not perform itself, and then he said something short that made the young man nod and straighten his shoulders. Essian touched his arm briefly and walked on. He noticed her. He stopped. Analyst Yenthal, he said. His pronunciation was good. It had always been good. Ambassador. She paused. You arrived early. I always do. He said it without weight, but she noted it. She noted everything. How was the journey? Efficient, she said. He smiled at that, a brief, genuine thing. I'll see you tomorrow then. She watched him walk away down the corridor. Even now, in the middle of negotiations that would determine two civilizations' relationship for the next century, he moved like a man, with nowhere urgent to be. Not because nothing mattered. She had moved past that interpretation years ago, because he had already done the thinking that urgency was supposed to force. The urgency had been spent elsewhere, earlier, in quiet rooms, with long documents, and what was left was just the work. The negotiations lasted 11 days. Yenthal had expected them to be difficult. They were not easy, but the quality of the difficulty was not what she had anticipated. There was no theatrics, no escalation, no moment where the table seemed likely to break. Essien moved through each session with the same quality she had been watching since the first day present. Precise and unhurried in a way that did not read as indifference, but as a kind of deep patience that had been built, not inherited. The Varric team, by contrast, was adjusting to something. She could see it in her colleagues. The negotiating frameworks they had brought, the models built from every previous treaty, every resolved dispute, every situation where the Varric had ended up with the better outcome, kept not quite fitting. Not because Essien was being difficult. Because he was not trying to win. He was trying to build something. On the fourth day, senior negotiator Hevel Dunn leaned over to Yenthal during a recess and said, very quietly, "What does he want?" She had thought about this. "He wants an outcome that works in 500 years, she said. Hevel Dunn stared at her. "He asked us that question in the first session," she said. "What do we want the border to look like in 500 years? Did you notice that no one answered it?" Hevel Dunn said nothing. "We've never been asked that question before," she said. "We're the ones who usually decide what the future looks like." The final terms were settled on the 9th day, though the documentation took 2 more. Koru, 2 returned to human administration. The 61 years of terraforming work was formally recognized in the treaty language. The Varric received extraction rights in a different system, one with significant mineral deposits, real value, honestly given in a location that had no strategic significance to anyone. The system sat outside every logistics corridor. It would make the Colonial Expansion Office's quarterly numbers look better. It would not make the Varric Empire stronger in any way that mattered. Everyone at the table understood the final shape of the outcome. No one at the table could identify the exact moment it had been determined. Yenthal had been watching. She thought she knew. She thought it had been determined before the negotiations started in the construction of the terms Essien brought to the table, which were not winning terms or punishing terms, but terms designed to be acceptable, designed to give the Varric something to show at home, designed to resolve without humiliation, because unhumiliated opponents made better long-term neighbors. She had gone back to the contingency file. The newest version, she had obtained a copy through official channels as part of the treaty process. It was 603 pages now. There was a section near the end, added in the most recent revision, titled Post-Conflict Stabilization and Relationship Architecture. It was 40 pages long. It had been written 3 years ago. On the final evening, after the signing, the formal dinner, and the careful small talk that follows both, Yenthal found Essien on one of the station's observation decks. He was standing at the viewport looking at the star field. He had a drink in his hand. He did not seem to be doing anything in particular. She stood beside him. They looked at the stars for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "What do you call it?" she said. "The planning. The contingency work. The process of mapping every way something could go wrong before it does." He considered it. Not performing consideration, actually thinking it through, the way he did everything. "We call it being careful," he said. "Some people call it risk management. The official term in our strategic offices is contingency architecture. But most people just call it being careful." She looked at the stars. "It has always seemed to me," she said, "that it requires a specific relationship with fear. To do it the way your people do it." He turned to look at her. Not surprised. Thoughtful. "We've always had a lot to lose," he said. "That's all it is, really. When you have a lot to lose, you spend a lot of time thinking about how to avoid losing it." He paused. "I don't think we're uniquely afraid. I think we're just very aware of what we care about. She thought about Mara Ose, the offered food, the complete absence of alarm on a small ship that had just been hailed by a Varek survey fleet. The woman who had been calm not because she had nothing to fear, but because she had already sat in a room somewhere and thought through what to do if this went wrong, and knowing that had set her free to smile. "We have a word," Yenthal said, "Keldara. It means the state of having nothing left to fear. It is our highest cultural aspiration, the condition we have spent 50,000 years trying to reach." Essien listened. "I think," she said, slowly, "that we misunderstood the direction." He did not ask what she meant. He simply waited. "We believed the goal was to remove the fear," she said. "Defeat enough enemies, secure enough space, build enough power that eventually nothing could threaten you. Keldara as an endpoint." She paused. "But you did not remove your fear. You converted it into plans, into preparation, into the 40,000 people on Koru, 2 who were alive at the end of this because someone wrote down what to do long before it needed doing." She looked at him. "You are afraid of everything," she said, "and it has made you very difficult to destroy." Essien looked at the stars for a moment. "We prefer the word careful," he said, not disagreeing, just offering the softer translation. She took it. She returned to her quarters and sat at the desk and opened a blank notation file, the kind used for analytical observations that were not yet ready to be formal reports. She thought about what word the Varek would need. Not Keldara, the absence of fear. Something else. Something for the conversion of fear into